Superintendent Ian Palmer also warned the general public, quote, "We believe he represents a serious threat to women who he knows or who he might come into contact with. Officers believe he has made contact with women through social networking sites, such as Facebook and dating websites. The investigation is revealing a crime of significant violence." This is Red Rum, a podcast focusing on the true victims of crime. Clare Wood. Clare Wood grew up in Batley, a historic market and mill town in West Yorkshire, most known for its manufacturing of Fox's biscuits, as well as being home to the brilliant, passionate MP, Jo Cox, who was sadly murdered in June 2016 in a frenzied shooting and stabbing attack by a far-right extremist. When Clare was a teenager, her parents separated, but her mother met Michael Brown soon after, and by the time Clare was 15, she actually asked Michael to legally adopt her, and so became his daughter. She called him Dad and, along with her stepsister Samantha, her brother Adam, and her mother Sheila, the five of them spent the next 10 years playing happy families. Clare was completely supported and loved throughout her teenage years and education. She lived in Batley, working in a local clothing shop until 1999. And then she married Justin Wood. Justin was everything she'd looked for in a partner, and her parents loved him like their own son. Around this time, Clare and Justin had a baby girl. Unfortunately, over the next few years, Clare struggled with mental health issues and was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which meant that she suffered from low self-esteem and found it difficult to socialise. Because of this, Clare was extremely close to her parents, but whenever she would visit them, she would give them the impression that everything was fine. Clare loved being at home, but she didn't want to worry her family, so tended to keep things to herself. By 2004, Clare's relationship with Justin had become too difficult to juggle alongside everything else she was going through, and even though they still cared very much for each other, the couple made the decision to end the relationship. They decided that Justin would look after their daughter during the week so that Clare could have time to focus on her mental health, and Clare would have her at the weekends. In 2005, things took even more of a tragic turn when Clare's mum passed away from cancer. The devastating loss and separation pushed Clare to make some big changes in her life. She first moved to Carlisle before relocating again, and this time settling just across the city of Manchester in a new flat in Blackfriars in Salford. It's the perfect place for exploring, raising a child and meeting new people. Clare could also afford a place with its own garden, which was a major positive for raising a youngster. By the time Clare had moved to Blackfriars, she was also on the correct medication for her bipolar disorder, so she was feeling much more settled and stable. It was around this time, Clare decided to start dating again. By this point, it was early 2007, and although online dating websites like Match.com had been around since 1995, they weren't really in the mainstream like they are today with the likes of Tinder and Bumble. Clare set up a Lonely Hearts profile and wrote, quote, "I am a talkative, affectionate woman who would love to hear from someone who is relatively sane in my area. I would like to meet a respectful, affectionate man." She also listed a number of her likes and dislikes and said that her biggest fear was, quote, "dying painfully." Back in the early 2000s, online dating was sometimes a lonely and scary place, and even though Clare had signed up to a number of dating sites, she'd had no luck so far and she was starting to feel down about it. Things would soon change when Clare received a Facebook friend request from a man she didn't know, called George Appleton. She was a little sceptical, She'd never met him, but she was curious as to who this young, athletic, good-looking man was. And after he sent her a private message, Clare quickly saw how smooth and charming he could be. During their first few conversations, Clare had in the back of her mind the fact that a number of her friends had found love in a similar fashion through random Facebook friend requests. Through the many messages that followed, George described himself as kind, caring and funny, and Clare soon learnt that George lived just around the corner at Adelphi Court, also in Salford. The couple began dating, and it wasn't long before they began a serious relationship. Clare truly believed she had found the man of her dreams. The first few weeks and months were pure bliss, with big acts of affection and deep declarations of love and care. However, Clare began to see red flags and became concerned when George expressed his distrust in her leaving the house. She had never given him any reason not to trust her, and she trusted him completely. Even so, George wasn't happy about Clare going out and seeing her friends if he wasn't around. He also began reading her messages and checking out who her Facebook friends were. There was even an incident during an argument one evening where George became so enraged, he ripped the phone off of the wall and shouted at Clare, telling her that she wasn't going anywhere. Clare decided she and George should go to visit Michael, Clare's adoptive father, up north. George charmed his way into Michael's home, and once Michael started sharing details of his job as a prison officer, George realised he could connect with Michael over this. George told Michael he had spent a short amount of time in prison. He assured Michael it was nothing serious, and later that evening, Clare called her dad to reassure him. She told him George's prison sentence was for a motor offence and it wasn't serious. Michael, however, knew this was unlikely. As a prison officer himself, he knew that George wouldn't have done time for a first-time motor offence unless it was very serious. George knew that Clare's father and brother didn't take kindly to him and began to encourage her to spend time away from them. Clare began to feel isolated and cut off from the outside world of family and friends. By September of the following year, Clare had become withdrawn and down. She noticed that George was spending more and more time away from her, but didn't like her to have the same freedom and space. When she questioned him on it, he would get angry, and his violent temper would last for days and days, and sometimes up to 3 or 4 weeks. Whilst Clare was dealing with the strain her relationship was putting on her own happiness, she was careful not to share her worries with her dad. She needed to protect herself and her family, so kept all of her concerns to herself. She knew that if she told her dad, and George found out, she would be in huge trouble. One morning in mid-October, George had stormed out of the house after an argument. A sneaking suspicion crept into Clare's mind. George was spending more and more time away from her. He seemed distant, and he kept starting arguments for no reason. Clare opened up her laptop, clicked the web browser, and saw George's Facebook sitting open. She clicked onto his messages and saw confirmation of her deepest fears. The man she loved, the man she cared so deeply for and trusted with all of her heart, had betrayed her in the most disrespectful way. Within the many messages between George and a number of different women, she realised that there were 4 women who seemed to have deeper, more solid relationships with him. When George arrived back later that day, Clare confronted him. After initially lying to her face, George eventually admitted to having 4 long-term affairs with different women. He told Clare he was sorry and that he loved her. Clare told him to leave, but he very quickly worked his way back into her life. George's manipulation and lies became more frequent. It seemed to be second nature to him. George also became violent towards Clare, and this is when things really shifted. He accused her of spying on him and betraying his trust, and that all of this was her fault. Clare felt completely and utterly trapped. George had a relationship with her daughter. He knew where she lived. He knew her friends, and he had friends who lived nearby and could keep an eye on her. Clare couldn't get away. And on top of this, George had an emotional hold over Clare. He had come into her life when she had just relocated. She had just left her husband, and her mother had passed away. She was extremely vulnerable, and it quickly became apparent that George had seen this and preyed upon Clare. One afternoon in October, she sat down to write a letter to George. The letter explained why she had to leave him and that she would always care for him, but she needed to put her daughter first. Quote, "Don't use this as an excuse to go off the rails. Bear in mind you were lucky enough not to go to prison again, and I did give you a chance. And I had to do this by letter because you just won't listen to me at all. I have told you before how I feel, and you have chosen to ignore it hoping it will go away. It hasn't. Each day I feel worse. I have to consider my daughter also, and after all you've done, I can't have you back. It's not fair on her, and she knows I'd never be happy with you. I want you to be well. Good luck. I really mean it." She goes on to say that she's scared of him. She asks him to leave her alone and says that they should cut contact completely. Despite the thoughtful and honest letter, George was furious. He refused to let Clare go and told her he would change. He said that he realised how much he loved her and he would do anything not to hurt her again. Clare stuck to her word and asked George to leave her alone, but this, of course, infuriated him. He began to stalk her, following her to her daughter's school, texting her constantly and even waiting outside her house for hours on end. George's obsession spiraled, and Clare eventually confided in her dad. She called him and told him everything. She said that the relationship was completely over, but that George hadn't taken it well, and he was beginning to harass her. Michael told Clare to leave Salford. He suggested that she drove up north and stayed with him for a little while, as she'd just lost her job and didn't want to leave her daughter behind in Salford. About a week after Clare had broken up with George, he made contact with her again and started to threaten her. He began turning up at the house in the early hours of the morning, screaming that he was going to burn her house down, and if she didn't let him in, the next time they were alone together, he would beat her up, smash the windows, have her stabbed, and even hit her with an iron. Clare immediately went to Pendleton police station and reported the incidents. The very next day, however, Clare was woken up by a violent pounding on her front door, followed by shouting, screaming, and the smashing of a window. It was George. He was demanding that she let him in. By this point, Clare was genuinely scared for her life and called 999 to request help. She explained the situation and waited patiently by the door for a police officer to turn up or call back. George eventually left, but no one from the police station turned up until much later in the afternoon. The officer that arrived wasn't actually there to investigate that morning's incident, but was there to take a statement about the incident the previous day. When Clare asked where the help she'd requested had gotten to that day, the officer checked. Despite 26 requests for officer help, no one had been sent out at all because of, quote, insufficient police officers being available. George was soon arrested on suspicion of criminal damage. Later that same day, however, he was released on bail on the condition that he didn't see or contact Clare, nor was he to go anywhere near her house. Unfortunately, it was around this time that George carefully crafted his way back into Clare's life. Clare had decided not to tell any of her closest friends. She didn't want to worry them, and as time passed, George's contact was less violent and leant more towards how he used to be. During this time, however, although George wasn't physically seeing Clare, he was contacting her on Facebook and by phone. He actually managed to convince Clare that because he had stopped smoking cannabis, he was much calmer and less paranoid. He also told her he had changed and he wouldn't push anything on her. He wanted to be on good terms, but the restraining order was restrictive and meant that he couldn't visit his friends who lived close to Clare because he would be breaking his bail terms. Clare agreed to this and wrote a letter to the police asking for charges against George to be dropped. Although the restraining order was initially upheld, it was amended just a number of weeks afterwards, with Clare agreeing that she believed George was no longer a threat. Clare did keep in contact with George over this period, but at a distance, until one evening in mid-January, George got in contact with her to ask if she wanted to come round. He just wanted to clear the air. Clare agreed, but as soon as she arrived at George's flat, Clare realised she'd made a mistake. She politely listened to what he had to say, and as soon as it was possible for her to do so, she tried to leave. George wasn't happy about this and told her that he thought she'd come round because she wanted to get back together. He told her she needed him. He then proceeded to rape her. Clare reported the rape to the police the very next morning, whilst the following morning at 2:43 a.m, George called the police station to ask if a complaint had been made against him. It was confirmed to him that a complaint had indeed been made. 45 minutes later, police arrived at George's home address to arrest him for the sexual assault. George denied all charges, and unfortunately, by the afternoon, he was bailed out due to lack of sufficient evidence. On the 20th of January, Clare was asked to come down to the police station so she could take part in a video interview to document the sexual assault. However, because of another interview overrunning, Clare was told that the interview needed to be postponed and she would have to come back in another day. This is where the police work gets a little bit confusing. Clare was finally video interviewed about the sexual assault. The report was then submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service, or the CPS, whose job is to provide legal advice to the police so that they can then decide if a suspect should face criminal charges. There was no mention of the sexual assault, which had been documented just days before. The CPS's advice was therefore perhaps somewhat inadequate. They couldn't make a thorough recommendation because they didn't have all of the information. Even so, the CPS did advise that George needed to be warned under the Harassment and Protection Act in relation to contacting and harassing Clare. George was issued with a fixed penalty notice for causing criminal damage, but was not issued with a warning under the Harassment Act. Around a week later, Clare's dad Michael became worried when he couldn't make contact with Clare. He wasn't sure what to do. He called Justin, Clare's ex-husband and the father of their child. He asked if he had heard from Clare recently, and when Justin said he hadn't, Michael began to panic. Justin said he would call in at Clare's house on his way to work. As Justin approached the house in his car, he pulled up and examined Clare's home. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Clare's car was in the drive and the curtains were drawn. Justin knocked on the door and waited, but when there was no answer, he decided to take a look around the back. As he approached the garden, he noticed that the back door was ajar. He walked into the house and called out for Clare, but there was no answer. He slowly climbed the stairs and made his way towards the main bedroom. He turned the handle, called out for Clare, and peered inside. What he found was chilling. He noticed the smell of burnt flesh and then saw the charred remains of Clare. There was an ashtray on top of her body. The police quickly determined that Clare had been strangled to death before being set on fire in an attempt to make it seem like an accident. It was soon revealed that George had entered the house with a spare key he owned. It's thought that because he hadn't used it in the months prior, Clare thought that he had misplaced the key. George crept into the house, hid in the bathroom, and lay in wait for Clare to return home. When Clare entered the bedroom, she had no idea George was waiting for her. He then attacked Clare. He raped her, then strangled her, and finally set her body on fire before fleeing the scene. It later transpired that George had gone round to his friend Andrew's house. He stayed there for a number of hours and into the early morning. He told Andrew he was worried that he'd be sent back to prison because Clare had reported him for the attack on her. George smoked some cannabis and then, without warning, left Andrew's house, got into his red Ford Escort, and sped off down the road. The police named George as their prime suspect, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. Superintendent Ian Palmer also warned the general public, quote, "We believe he represents a serious threat to women who he knows or who he might come into contact with. Officers believe he has made contact with women through social networking sites, such as Facebook and dating websites. We would strongly urge anyone who has had contact with him not to maintain that contact and to report the fact to police as soon as possible. The investigation is revealing a crime of significant violence." Unquote. On the 12th of February 2009, George's car was found outside a derelict pub in Salford, just a mile away from Clare's home. Inside, officers found George's body. He had hanged himself. A major part of the inquest into Clare's death focused on the incompetencies of the Greater Manchester Police Force. George had killed Clare just 72 hours after he was released by police for the attack and attempted rape. It was well known that George had threatened to kill Clare and that he told her he would have her stabbed and would burn her house down. The police officer investigating the incident dismissed the comments as throwaway comments and that George was a, quote, "quiet, mild-mannered man." The report submitted to the CPS on Clare's case had been deemed as low risk, despite the multiple attacks and many charges brought against George. The Independent Police Complaints Commission found that there were, quote, "systematic failures within the Greater Manchester Police Force that ultimately let Clare down." The IPCC stated that there were significant delays in getting information out to Clare and collecting statements and evidence from her. The conclusion of the inquest was that although there were individual failures in Clare's case by individual officers, there was no specific failure that could have otherwise prevented the murder. Not to include the sexual assault details in the Crown Prosecution Service information, as well as the time it took to submit the file, shows a clear lack of understanding of domestic violence. George Appleton had a number of previous convictions, dating back to 2001, including harassment and breaching a restraining order against 2 separate women, as well as 1 count of kidnapping. Clare's dad, Michael, said that if Clare had known any of this, she never would have continued dating George. Michael couldn't understand why Clare hadn't been told about George's past in the first place. Michael is a powerhouse. He's a passionate man and clearly takes no bullshit. Michael decided that change was desperately needed. Over the next few years, Michael campaigned for a change in the law. He named the proposed law Clare's Law, and it stated that if someone has a history of domestic violence, then a new partner should be able to access this information. He couldn't see why this wasn't already in place. He was determined to change things. As a result of his tireless campaigns, Clare's Law was passed, and the police are now able to access this information and pass it on if appropriate once they are asked. If domestic abuse services believe that there may be information that gives them cause for concern, they are also now able to disclose this information and support the person in need. Before Michael passed away, he had described Clare as, quote, "a free spirit. She never brought trouble to the door. She was a canny lass with a wicked sense of humour."